Hey guys, it's Connor coming to you from the World Divide. I'm here back in my room with my freaky but fascinating eye tree in the background. Today I'm going to be talking about kind of the situation in Russia-Ukraine, as well as some potential conflict zones that could spell an expansion of the current war. So I'm going to briefly kind of go over what's going on in Ukraine. And right now, with the weather patterns that we're seeing, there's a lot of rain, a lot of thick mud. So any movements from either side is definitely hindered quite a bit. The focus in recent days has been on the situation in Bakhmut, and while that situation is deteriorating for the Ukrainian side, they have somewhat put the Russians nearly at a standstill, with the exception of some recent gains in the southern suburbs and some recent gains pushing up the MO3 highway towards Sloviansk. I believe what the Russians are going to do at this point is not put so much pressure on trying to capture blocks of Bakhmut itself, but they will continue to pressure it, but more or less try to increase their gains in the north, increase their gains in the south, to increase the length in which Ukrainians have to supply their forces within Bakhmut, basically lengthening the cauldron to make it, to create basically a firing bag, which is kind of the situation that we're seeing right now. But it's going to be very slow, very methodical. It's very hard to tell really what's happening in that area. It seems like overall in the front, both sides are pretty much mostly at a stalemate, apart from a few small, slow Russian advances. Another near encirclement that we're seeing is actually in the region of Avdiivka. The Russians have consolidated their hold over Vadian and are pushing north, as well as further to the west, flanking Pervomaisk from the south in a pincer move. But again, very slow, very methodical. We shouldn't really see too much in the coming weeks. Now, when the weather does become more favorable, say end of March, April, May, June, things are going to intensify for both sides. There are hundreds of thousands of Russian forces that have not engaged in combat, that are simply sitting around the perimeter of Ukraine, but as well as Ukraine is preparing 2 army corps for their spring offensive. I don't believe at this point Ukraine has the resources to even attempt some sort of counteroffensive. Bakhmut has been a part of the front line that Ukrainian forces have been forcibly drawn into. I think it's a part of the front line that the Russians, at the moment, seem to have had the initiative. And while kind of the early stages of the battle, the Russians were taking heavier losses, I think. Now, I think with the current situation, the situation is probably more untenable for Ukrainian forces, just by looking at the maps and kind of analyzing the data that I had. The talks of kind of the large-scale Russian counteroffensive that was going to happen on the 1-year anniversary never happened. Talks of Ukrainian counteroffensive that was going to happen in March, April, might also never happen. I believe that, and I was kind of fooled by this as well, that this was an information campaign. It was, designed to deceive people, and I actually, I thought for quite a while that the Russians were going to launch a large-scale counteroffensive around the 1-year anniversary. But the closer we got to that date, the more skeptical I became that was actually going to happen. Um, so that's kind of what we're seeing right now, both sides. Recently, there was also a heavy missile strike, actually the largest one this year, um, using combined, you know, the using some of the drones that Russia has, using some cruise missiles, as well as a new system that they've recently introduced um, to the theater, the Kinzhal hypersonic missile. Now, this is a missile that was basically near the end stages of its development at the um, beginning of the war, and now it looks like Russia has successfully ramped up production of these missiles, and Ukraine cannot defend themselves against this missile. They travel at speeds of Mach 9, Mach 10. Um, the targets that they hit were important industrial sites for Ukraine, places where there were reserves. It looks like both sides seem to be trying to adapt around each other as far as missile strikes and infrastructure strikes are concerned. Now, the Ukrainians are definitely in a more dire situation, as their air defenses have been worn down. What the Russians usually do is they'll launch some strikes. They'll send their A-50 radar aircraft in the sky, and they'll analyze exactly how Ukrainian air defenses have responded to the situation, and then from there, strike those positions, which means Ukraine has to constantly reshuffle its air defense forces, which they are doing very effectively, and they're very mobile. And that's something that I feel like the Ukrainians have had an advantage of throughout the entire war, is mobility. Like I've said multiple times, the kind of the current landscape of things, the Russians are in a massive C shape. So if they want to redeploy forces, say from Belarus to Donetsk, they have to make a massive hook. And say Kiev, the Ukrainians have to do something similar. All they have to do is move from Kiev down, and that's about a third of the distance. So now looking at these some other potential conflict zones, there has been some recent news in Belarus, in Moldova, in Georgia, and I think these are all relevant things to consider, but you shouldn't also be too quick to jump to conclusions on what's happening here. In Belarus, there's more movements of more Russian equipment, more troop movements, everything of that sort. President Lukashenko actually made a visit to China to talk with President Xi Jinping. I believe they were talking about how they would collaborate in the future, how they could develop a peace plan. What I believe is happening there is that if China ends up deciding to send lethal aid to Russia, they're going to try to do it through secondary or tertiary channels. They're not going to do it directly. They're going to do it through private investments, private companies. So it's not really Beijing's responsibility, it's the responsibility of these private companies, or the responsibility of Belarus. And we've kind of already seen things like this happen between China and Russia. They have indirectly been providing support, but they've been doing it with a level of deniability, so they can try to find a balance between negotiating and keeping things kind of open with the United States, even though our relationship with China is deteriorating, but at the same time supporting Russia. They're trying to draw this thin line, and I think eventually, maybe not in the near future, maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years from now, eventually the situation will become untenable, and China will have to take a side. But it's really beneficial if the war stops where it is, and if Beijing can act as a ally to both parties. That would be the most favorable thing for Beijing. So that's a situation I'm watching very closely. There is heavy fortifications along the Polish border, along the Belarusian border, along Kaliningrad. So things like that are happening. I don't think there will be. This will be the next place where the conflict expands. Um, Now, my feelings about Moldova and Transnistria are different. Um, there has been quite a bit of activity going on in Moldova. The government did collapse a little while ago and kind of reformed itself, but Moldova has always been quite an unstable country from its inception in 1992. In the region of Transnistria, the president of Tiraspol, or the president of Transnistria in Tiraspol, um, survived in an assassination attempt about 2 weeks ago. Um, Now, the perpetrators were caught. From what they are reporting, the plan was to place an 8 kilogram bomb underneath the bulletproof Land Cruiser that the president of the Transnistria region usually rides around in. Um, and what they were claiming was that the people who attempted this attack were Ukrainian saboteurs. Now, ever since the Russians have lost all their kind of holdings in the left bank of the Dnieper River, basically where Kherson City is, all of that, they lost that opportunity to potentially link up with Transnistria. Now, do I think the Russians will attempt to land on Kherson again? Absolutely. They're absolutely going to try to do that. Because Transnistria is in a very isolated situation right now. If any actions are going to be taken, it's not likely going to be from the Russian side. It's more or less, I think, more likely that the Ukrainians would attempt to launch an offensive on Transnistria. Now, the problem with this is that Transnistria is technically part of Moldovan territory. This is part of the Moldovan sphere of influence. So to avoid international condemnation and to avoid kind of having their public image tarnished, what the Ukrainians will have to do is get permission from the Moldovan government. And if both sides work together, then the situation in Transnistria may escalate. Now, hearing about the assassination attempt does make me pay more attention to this situation. I think it would be a ripe opportunity for NATO to try to take Transnistria, and it would really put the Russians in a difficult position. Either the Russians have to springboard another offensive from another direction to try to dampen the effects of an offensive on Transnistria, or if the situation becomes untenable, the Russians may have to use nuclear weapons. Do I think it's going to happen? I don't think so. I don't think the Russians will be put in a position in the near future where they have to use nuclear weapons. So I'm watching this situation as it develops. Certainly a possibility as the months drag on. And now there have been more recent reports of protests happening in Georgia, the country of Georgia, the Caucasus. Now, Georgia also has a few breakaway regions that also have Russian peacekeepers, occupiers within them. The region of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Now, Georgia is also a very, very, very unstable government. Saboteurs from both sides basically have their fingers inside the government. Same with Moldova. And what we saw was these protests. The protesters were waving around EU flags, United States flags, and it was protesting a law to prevent foreign, basically more foreign influence within media. And these laws are existent not only in the European Union, but also the United States. So it was kind of funny to see the United States and EU support the actions of the protesters. It would certainly benefit them to start another front within Georgia, expand the conflict this way. I think it would cause the Russians definitely some trouble, um, but it would be a lot more controllable for them than, say, something happening in Transnistria. The Russian, you know, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are right on the border with Russia. They'd be able to react a lot more quickly. So, I mean, all three of these regions are heating up, but at the current moment, it looks like nothing's going to happen, and we'll just continue to see pretty much status quo for the next, month, 2 months, 3 months, and then starting to heat up early summer to late summer. We should start to see things really all unfold, and it's going to be it's going to be really interesting to see how the situation develops from there. But that's all I have to say. Didn't even check what day it is, but I will put it in the tag. Thank you guys, and I'll see you again next time.